So I'm going to introduce next Elina Teplinsky. Elina is from the U.S., from the Pillsbury Law Firm. And I would say I had the pleasure to work with Elina when we first met, working on a project very appropriate for this conference on a loan guarantee project for a 2-unit large light water reactor that Exelon was planning to build in Texas. The loan guarantee application went very well. Sadly, the project was canceled because it was based on roughly $8 gas, and the gas in the United States is around $2 right now, so unfortunately. But I did get to meet Elina out of the project, so Elina, you're up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for the kind introduction. And Marilyn is absolutely right. We had the pleasure to work together on this very exciting project. It was about a decade ago. And it shows that some of these problems that we're seeing with these projects, they are ongoing. So a decade later, we're still discussing this topic of financing new nuclear build and trying to move it forward. And hopefully this conference will be a big step in doing that. So today I'm going to discuss one aspect of financing nuclear projects. I'm going to talk about development financial institution financing. This is really not something that has been discussed in great length before. And why is it especially important today? If you look at the challenges facing the world today, there are really two pressing needs that we see. One is providing to everyone, all citizens of every country, access to affordable, clean, and reliable energy. And if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, this need doesn't just tie in with Sustainable Goal number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. It ties in with pretty much almost every goal. So it ties into good health, it ties into clean water sanitation, industry, innovation, infrastructure, sustainable cities. You can look at every single goal, and having access to energy, electricity, is going to play in some way into that goal. So it's a basic requirement for economic development worldwide. At the same time, we have the challenge of dramatically needing to reduce CO2 emissions. As we saw in the UN IFCC report last year, we basically have about 12 years to mitigate a climate change catastrophe. The biggest victims of this catastrophe are going to be developing nations, which are most vulnerable to climate change impact. So, I think many in this room are very supportive of nuclear energy, and of course we would say, well, one of the most clear solutions to these challenges are the deployment of large nuclear power plants, which are based on proven technology. We know how to build these plants. There are more than 400 of them operating in the world. They produce clean baseload energy. So why can't we just use large nuclear as a solution to climate change? Unfortunately, large plants may not be the best fit for certain developing nations. They may be a good fit for others, but not all. And why is that? There are several factors. Some of these countries do not have sufficient grid size to be able to handle a 1,000-megawatt nuclear power plant. Others simply need power off the grid. There are, of course, high capital costs to these projects, as mentioned in Paul's presentation. Operating a large nuclear power plant requires significant human resources, requires trained operators, people who understand construction, development of nuclear power plants, and that takes a long time to develop. Cooling water is an issue for some developing nations, as large nuclear power plants generally have a need for significant cooling water. And then there is the need for security as well, security and safeguards for large new nuclear power plants. So it seems that despite seeming to be the a key proportion of the solution, some nations may not be able to use large nuclear as a way to address their challenges. So we now look at SMRs. Could SMRs be a potential solution to these challenges? And I think the answer is yes, for many reasons. One reason is that the SMRs can potentially, once the technologies are proven and commercialized, they can be deployed a lot quicker. So let's say you could build an SMR potentially in 2 to 4 years, depending on the technology. With microreactors, those could be deployed in about 12 months. These reactors, they can be custom tailored to grid size. They can be even used in microgrids. They could be used off the grid. They can be used in island nations, for example, and remote locations, because some of these designs do not need to be refueled. So some designs are simply operating for 20 to 40 years without need for refueling. Some of the advanced designs also have other safety benefits, so you don't need large evacuation zones. There are proliferation benefits. Some of the reactors also, based on the smaller size, have lower capital costs, even though there are issues to be discussed that potentially cost per megawatt may be higher for some of these designs, but overall the capital costs are lower, and if a developing nation simply cannot afford a 2,000 megawatt project, an SMR may be a solution. You also have the potential to scale up. So let's say you have a country that is growing, that currently does not have large demand, doesn't have the right grid, but maybe it will in 10 to 20 years. SMRs can be scaled up fairly easily, and especially once the technology is proven and has been built several times, the cost can also be lower. And I spoke about cooling water. Some of the designs are also designed with lower cooling water needs, so they can be a solution to that issue as well. So what is one of the obstacles of deploying these designs in developing nations? Well, it's the topic of this session, which is financing. Financing is a big issue for new nuclear in general, but it can be even a bigger issue for developing countries that don't have the capital resources, and also for the vendors. So in Paul's presentation, he spoke about vendor financing for some of these projects. Well, when you have a large, reputable vendor with potentially government backing deploying a project and exporting the reactor, you potentially have access to some financing, whether it's private or public. With some of the companies that we're seeing in the market today, these are startups. So they don't have their own financing. They need to secure financing from other sources, or they need to raise it in some way. And then the United Nations also acknowledged the need for financing, stating that financial flows are falling short of what is needed today. So it's an issue that is well understood. So now we look at development finance institutions as one of the ways to resolve this issue. If you look at the goals of these finance institutions, they provide financing, advising, and technical support to development projects. Seems to work quite well for what we're discussing, SMR projects in developing nations. You look at the World Bank mission, one of their mission statements is to end extreme poverty, to promote shared prosperity. It seems to work quite well for what we're discussing. And in addition to that, development financial institutions, DFIs, have been heavily involved in financing energy projects specifically. To add to that, these institutions have moved away from financing carbon-heavy projects. So just this year, the World Bank has announced that absent special circumstances, it will not finance upstream oil and gas projects because of the climate change issues. In addition to that, I think as Paul discussed in his presentation, there are some challenges in getting various institutions to support new nuclear because of certain risks, such as construction risks. The World Bank is really supposed to be stepping in for exactly these types of projects, right? They're supposed to provide financing when there is a high cost and there is risk, but there is a development goal in mind. And it seems like increasingly these DFIs, they are acknowledging the potential for nuclear power. For example, the Asian Development Bank specifically noted it last year. However, why aren't we seeing any DFI financing for nuclear? Well, it's unfortunately because most, if really not all at this point, have refused to finance new nuclear power projects. Even the EBRD in the EU, which has historically had financed nuclear projects, has adopted an unspoken policy to not do so unless there is a safety-related issue or there is a decommissioning of a project. So they provided some funding, for example, for Chernobyl remediation, but they won't provide funding for new nuclear. Why, despite all of these factors that I've outlined, they are refusing to provide this financing? The most common reason, I would say, is just politics. There are certain members of these institutions, member states, that oppose nuclear power on ideological and political grounds. So because of that opposition, some of these institutions have adopted this policy to not finance nuclear. At the same time, there are other factors that are more easily mitigated than just ideology. One is the same issues that we're seeing in general financing of new nuclear projects, DFIs are seeing as well. So they're worried about the high capital costs, they're worried about construction delays, cost overruns. They're also, because they have not historically financed new nuclear, they don't really have the technical expertise to evaluate these issues. So they simply understand the ideology of nuclear, but they are not really ready to bring in teams that are technically qualified to evaluate these projects. And because of these reasons, I mentioned the Asian Development Bank acknowledged the potential benefits of new nuclear. However, despite that, they have chosen to maintain their current policy of not providing financing for nuclear power generation. Let's go back to SMRs. Can SMRs overcome some of these obstacles? And my thesis here is that yes, they can, and maybe this is a good place to start in a discussion with DFIs. So I mentioned that DFIs are worried about capital costs. When you look at financing SMRs, potentially capital is outlaid for a shorter period of time. There's lower capital costs, less vulnerability to long-term interest rates. The construction risks also decrease because of the modular aspects of some of these reactors, so they can be completely produced in a factory assembled, and thus reduce some of the project management and the construction risks. In general, there are some of the technical concerns I mentioned. The safety aspects and the proliferation aspects can also be reduced with SMRs. So lots of ways that SMRs can potentially address some of the concerns voiced by DFIs in the past. So the conclusion is that DFIs really should provide financing for SMRs in light of the importance of mitigating climate change and the benefits that these projects can bring to developing nations. It's really time to shift this policy stance for DFIs. And I think this conference is a good point to start that conversation. I know that the conversation has been going on in several markets, including the United States, but it's really time to make this conversation an international one. And I think if countries and organizations worldwide start acknowledging and putting some pressure on DFIs to finance new nuclear, we could potentially see in the near future a change in this policy and a great benefit to financing SMRs through DFI financing. And the last point is I've talked about DFI financing as the funds provided to these projects, and these funds are potentially significant. So, for example, in 2017, the World Bank provided $8.8 billion of funding for energy projects. That's quite a lot of money, especially when we're speaking about SMR projects. But even more important to mention is that the funding serves as a motivator, a mobilizer, and a halo effect for private funding. So with that $8.8 billion of World Bank funding came $3.3 billion of private funding. So this mobilizing effect is not one to be dismissed and underscores the importance of securing DFI financing for SMR projects. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for a question? I think we have time for one question if somebody has one. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Conchita Fazio from the European Commission. I have one curiosity, because you address here SMRs in a generic way. Are you thinking on a specific reactor technology that answers all the promises that were listed in one of your first slides?
I'm not thinking of any particular technology. Of course, for example, we as a firm that advises a number of companies in the nuclear industry, we have a lot of clients with different technologies, and we know all of the companies, or most of the companies in the industry. There are quite a few technologies that would address these challenges. I think most of the technologies that are going through some of the licensing processes today, whether it's with CNSC in Canada or the NRC in the United States or the UK, one example is NuScale in the United States. You have X Energy. You have a number of designs, worldwide, including in Russia and design in France. So as long as these designs are modular and they're scalable and they offer some of the safety and proliferation benefits. So, for example, I've discussed the no need to refuel for several years. A number of these designs offer all of those benefits. So I'm not thinking of a particular design. Given the 16 minutes involved, I wanted to address some of the features that are common across a number of these designs.
Great. Thank you, Elina, and thank you for the question.